Hey everybody, this is Mr. Moppin coming at you, and we are now taking a look at the fifth video, part 5, in our series, taking a look at APUSH topic 4.8, looking at President Andrew Jackson and overall federal power. Now, last time, or in previous videos, we've talked about how Andrew Jackson is going to be an iconoclast in terms of what the American presidency meant up to that time period. A willingness to use informal advisors like the kitchen cabinet, a willingness to use the veto power more than any other president, a willingness to defy a Supreme Court ruling, a willingness to destroy the Bank of the United States, and even a willingness to go down to South Carolina and hang some nullies during the tariff crisis. And a large part of the results of this, new revolutionary style of being president, one of the effects will be the re-emergence of the two-party system that's going to be happening. Now, if you recall, back in the 1790s, we saw the creation of the first two major political parties in the United States, the Federalists, led by Hamilton, and the Democratic Republicans, led by Jefferson. And they'll battle it out for about a generation, with the Democratic Republicans ultimately defeating the Federalists. And by the time we got to 1820, there really was just one game in town, at least in terms of political parties, and that was the Democratic Republicans. And that, of course, was the era of good feelings. Now, even though the era of good feelings, sounds nice, we hopefully should know that there's going to be still tremendous differences of opinion, especially along sectional lines, North versus South. But the rise of Jackson, coupled with these other things, is really going to be the final, breaking point for this era of good feelings. And so, basically, what the major axis, point is for these two political parties to finally emerge is really going to be centered on Andrew Jackson himself. Whether or not you were a supporter, a fan of Andrew Jackson and his policies, or you were an opponent of Andrew Jackson and his policies. Those that were supporters of the presidents were going to just simply become Democrats. And note, this is the same Democrat Party that exists today. The Democrats of Joe Biden and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton are directly descendants of the Democratic Party that coalesces around Andrew Jackson. So be mindful of that. Those that were opponents of Andrew Jackson would become known as the Whigs. Now, the name Whigs coming from a British version of the same party, and basically in England that meant, the party that was in opposition to the king. And of course, that kind of speaks volumes in terms of how they viewed Andrew Jackson. This was the group that, for example, would, derisively describe Andrew Jackson as King Andrew the First. So with that being said, since we have we have a re-emergence of two major parties, it's pretty important to be able to know the distinctions between these two major parties on the issues at the time. And to kind of help you remember this, the Democrats, in many respects, are going to be the descendants of the old Democratic Republicans. So, for example, 1830s into 1840s Democrats are going to be opposed to a national bank. Remember, Jackson's going to kill the bank. They're going to be opposed to protective tariffs, just like, the Democratic Republicans back in the day. They're going to be opposed to federal spending for internal improvements. They believe in the small federal government. Once again, this is all, descending from the early days of the Democratic Republican Party. Excuse me. And, the Democrats are going to have a lot of their base of support coming from southern and western frontier farmers. So things like land prices are going to be very, very important to the Democrats, making sure those prices stay low, they stay reasonable, and fear over land speculation that was certainly happening during this time period. And of course, the Democrats, still had this, Jeffersonian idea to some degree of a mostly rural America. Made of farmers, and these folks were very leery of big business. So they were worried about the growing industrial Northeast and how it might exploit southern and western farmers. So keep in mind the base of support for this party is going to be southern and westerners, but also it's going to include urban workers, particularly urban immigrants. You're going to be seeing a lot of the, for example, Irish immigrants that are starting to come into the United States now in larger and larger numbers, settling in big major cities like New York and Boston and Philadelphia. And those folks will tend to be supporters of the Democrat Party. And this is the beginning of the political machines associated with the Democratic Party in those big cities like Tammany Hall in New York City. So note, the Democratic Party is going to be an alliance of Southern and Western farmers and mostly urban immigrants. The Whigs, once again, descendants to some degree of the old Federalist Party, are going to be sharing some of those old-timey Federalist beliefs. For example, support for a national bank, support for protective tariffs to protect American businesses. These are folks that wanted a larger, more robust federal government. They wanted spending on infrastructure, internal improvements. And these were folks that tended to be a little bit wealthier on the whole than Democrats on the whole. Not, it's not an absolute for sure, but these were folks that tended to be a little bit more upper class, tended to be a little bit more white collar as that's starting to emerge during this time period. And they also tended to be a little bit more nativist in terms of, believing that, real Americans were those that were born here, and that there's a danger of these immigrants coming over, these Germans and Irish especially, coming over, that there's a sense they're not very American, or they're not going to be true real Americans, and that they're going to be exploited by the Democrats for electoral gain. So, the Whigs are going to have their base of support up in the northeast sector, mid-Atlantic states. So a lot of your urban areas, or urban states rather, are going to be more Whig dominated. And in the big cities where the poorer immigrants tended to be supportive of the Democratic Party, the wealthier, middle class to wealthier, once again, emerging white-collar folks are going to be more likely supporting the Whigs. Now note, these are just generalities. These are certainly not absolutes. You can find exceptions in either camp for sure. All right, so with that being said, let's wrap up the Jackson presidency. And, the Jackson presidency is certainly going to be tied to economic issues, at least in the latter part of his presidency. You remember last time that Jackson, believing that the Bank of the United States was an evil monopoly that was seemingly hell-bent on destroying America's farmers, is not going to be rechartered. President Jackson will veto that attempt to recharter it. And once that happens, it's now just days that are numbered, basically, for the Bank of the United States. So instead of just kind of waiting for the time to kind of drag out, Jackson decides, if this thing's going to die, let's kill it already. And so he pulls all federal funds out of this bank and begins to put it in these various state banks, or as critics will call them, pet banks, right? Banks that are favorable to what Andrew Jackson wants. The problem, though, is that it's going to start some noticeable economic instability. For its flaws, the bus is going to create more of a sense of economic stability, even though, yes, you could argue that it came to some degree at the expense of, poorer frontier farmers. Now, another thing that's going to be of concern is growing prices for frontier land. And, as we've said before, Democrats were very concerned about that because that's the base of support, these frontier farmers. In fact, over a 2-year period from 1834 to 1836, we're going to see frontier land prices go up by a staggering 500%. Speculation is going to be the order of the day out on the frontier. People are going to be, in essence, flipping property in an attempt to make quick money because the prices are just going up and up and up and up. But for people like Jackson, the concern is that those that actually would be using the land, actual farming of the land, they're going to be, negatively affected by the ability to try to purchase land. Whereas wealthy elitists on the coast that have no intentions on farming the land are just taking advantage of speculation to try to maximize profits. And while this is happening, more and more more and more land is being bought with soft currency. In other words, paper money that's been issued by random banks. The problem with that is that you don't know really how much value a lot of this currency has, because some of this currency wasn't even based on hard metals like gold and silver. It was just based on faith. Fly-by-night banks that kind of popped up and were willing to loan, what was to some degree kind of bogus money, is really going to create some economic instability. So Jackson is going to try to thwart the efforts of these kind of shady banks and try to create more reasonably priced land on the frontier by issuing what's going to be called the Specie Circular, which is an executive order that's going to dictate that the land frontier land that was purchased had to be bought in gold or silver. Therefore, you could not have these outrageously inflationary prices based on paper currency that may not have had much value. But unfortunately for Jackson, this isn't really going to change things particularly in terms of trying to promote economic stability. But for Jackson, it's not going to be his problem for much longer, because he's out the door. And the worst of what's going to become the Panic of 1837 is going to be happening after he is president. And for the most part, he's not going to get a lot of the blame, although historians have kind of more appropriately tied more of that blame to Jackson. But, in his time, Jackson doesn't receive a whole lot of blowback. But the person that does is going to be Martin Van Buren, the man that will win the next presidential election. In 1836, Martin Van Buren is going to be going up against a slew of Whig candidates, with the attempt by the Whigs to try to, divide the Democrat vote, try to steal Democrat votes from a number of different Whig candidates led by William Henry Harrison, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe and the War of 1812. But it's not going to quite work out for the Whigs. As you can see here, each of the Whig candidates are going to get some electoral support, but still Van Buren, as you can see here in the blue, is going to be able to piece together a nice national coalition to continue what is really going to be the Jackson dynasty. Martin Van Buren is the hand-picked successor to Jackson. Jackson, even though he is an iconoclastic president, will follow the two-term tradition established by many of his predecessors. And in many respects, this is going to be viewed as a third Jackson term to some extent, because Martin Van Buren was the loyal lieutenant for so many years for Andrew Jackson. But Martin Van Buren is going to be facing, in many respects, the problems established by his predecessor. The financial panic of 1837 is going to be the worst economic crisis America had seen up to this point. It was a real depression in many respects. We're going to be seeing banks fail across the country. We're going to see foreclosures on land. And it's going to be really, really bad for Van Buren. And Van Buren never really recovers from it. So understand the late 1830s is really going to be the reckoning of many of Jackson's bold economic policies that do not work out very well, but it's going to be Van Buren that's going to be left holding the bag, at least politically anyway. So we're going to leave it there for now. When we come back, we're going to have one last video highlighting the election of 1840 and some other issues along the old frontier. So we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.